This week I've written an Appalachian retelling of Hansel and Gretel. 2 hungry children, a house of candy, and more sugar than any soul needs. Here in my neck of the woods, rock candy is a favorite handmade treat. It's sugar boiled clear, colored bright, and broken into shards of light. Some folks call it stained glass candy because of the way the sun shines straight through it. While you listen, you'll watch rock candy come together in my kitchen, along with a vintage diorama of Hansel and Gretel. Then I'll use my rock candy to build a little stone fence across the front. If you've found your way here because the world is a little too loud, you've found the right place. This is a quiet corner where you can rest your mind and your eyes. So settle in for a spell and let's read a story together. Hansel and Gretel, Appalachian Edition. Next to the timber-thick forest, where the ridges rise so steep they swallow the sun by mid-afternoon, there lived a poor woodcutter and his 2 children, Arlo and Alma. Being lonely after his wife passed, the woodcutter took a second wife, but she was a woman with a heart as cold as a January creek. Now a gray fog had settled over the valley in those days. It wasn't a mist that rose from the creek. It was a heavy, sour kind of gloom that seeped right into the folks that lived there. It made neighbors suspicious and turned kin against kin. People who used to swap seeds and help bring the hay in now barred their doors and guarded their barns. This sour spirit dried up the well of kindness, leaving neighbor to look past neighbor just when they needed each other the most. Without a hand to lean on or a shared hearth to warm by, the folks grew as thin as the shadows, for a holler that won't stand together is bound to starve alone. One night the woodcutter lay in bed, his stomach growling like a tethered hound. "Wife," he sighed, "the flour sack is empty and the larder is bare. My heart is heavy with the thought of Arlo and Alma gone without." But the stepmother, her mind already set, whispered into the dark, "There's a place on the other side of the ridge called the poorhouse. Tomorrow we'll make like we're heading deep into the timber to chop wood, but we'll lead 'em across to the far trail and leave 'em to be found. They'll have a roof over their heads, and we'll have a chance to see another spring." The woodcutter fought it with a few weak words, but the sour gloom had sapped his will, and before the fire had died to ash, he'd given his nod. Arlo and Alma, their bellies too empty for sleep, were huddled in the loft, and they heard every terrible word that passed below. Alma commenced to cry, and her tears wetting the straw tick, but Arlo squeezed her hand tight. "Shh, sissy," he whispered. "Don't you worry. I've got a way figured out to find our way back." He waited until the house went quiet and the woodcutter's snores joined the wind in the chimney. Then he slipped out the back door and crept down to the creek's edge. The moon was high, and the small, smooth stones shone like silver coins beneath the ripples. Arlo reached into the cold water, filling his overall pockets with the white rocks until they sagged. Then he slipped back to bed to wait for the sun. At first light, the stepmother roused them with a shake. "Get up, you lazy bones. We've got a long walk ahead of us if we're to get a load of wood cut today." She handed them each a thin crust of bread, warning them it was all they'd see until supper. As they started up the ridge, Arlo kept turning to look back toward the cabin. "Arlo, what are you mooning at?" Pa called out. "Just looking at my white cat on the roof, Pa. She's watching us go," Arlo lied. "That ain't no cat, you fool boy," the stepmother snapped. "That's just the morning sun hitting the chimney stones." But Arlo wasn't looking at any cat. He was dropping those smooth creek stones, one by one, marking a silver trail through the deep timber. When they reached the deepest part of the hardwoods, the father stopped in a small clearing. "You young'uns gather up some brush and deadfall," he said, his voice trailing off as he looked at the ground. "I'll make you a fire so you won't catch a chill while we work." Arlo and Alma piled up a mountain of dead wood, and once the flames were licking at the air, the stepmother turned to go. "Lie down and rest yourselves. We're going just over the rise to fell some trees. When the work is done, we'll come back for you." To keep their hearts from sinking, the father tied a dry branch next to a dead hemlock nearby. As the wind caught it, the branch went thwack, thwack against the trunk, sounding for all the world like a steady axe blade. Believing their father was close by, the children relaxed and fell into a deep, hungry sleep. When they finally woke, the sun had dropped behind the ridge and the woods were as black as the bottom of a well. Alma started to sob, but Arlo pulled her close. "Wait for the moon, sissy, just wait for the moon." Sure enough, when the full moon crested the ridge, those smooth creek stones began to glow like tiny lanterns in the dirt. Arlo took Alma by the hand, and they followed that silver trail all through the night. As the first light of dawn touched the valley, they walked right up to their own front door and knocked. The stepmother opened the door, and her face went pale as a ghost, but she quickly masked it with a scowl. "You wicked children, why'd you sleep so long in the timber? We thought you'd never come home." But the woodcutter didn't say a word. He just pulled them into his arms, his eyes wet with a relief he couldn't hide. Not a week later, the hunger returned twice as sharp, and the children heard their stepmother whispering to Pa once more. "There's nothing left on the shelves but dust, and we've only a dry heel of bread. We must take 'em even deeper this time. So far they can't find the trail. There's no other way for us to live through the winter." The woodcutter's heart was heavy as a millstone, but he'd given in once, and he found he hadn't the strength to say no this time either. Arlo again waited until the adults were snoring. Then he crept toward the door to gather more creek stones. But his stepmother was wise to his tricks. The door was barred tight, and the latch wouldn't budge. He went back to the loft and held Alma's hand. "Don't you cry, sissy," he whispered. "I've got another way figured." Early the next morning, the stepmother rousted them and handed each a piece of bread even smaller than the last. As they walked toward the high ridges, Arlo didn't eat his crust. Instead, he crumbled it in his pocket, dropping tiny bits one by one onto the dirt. "Arlo, why are you always stopping and looking back?" Pa asked, his voice full of a weary kind of sorrow. "I'm looking at my pigeon on the roof, Pa. He's saying goodbye." "That ain't no pigeon, you simpleton," the stepmother hissed. "That's just the sun on the chimney." But Arlo kept silent, trailing the last of his bread until his pockets were empty and they were deep in the heart of the forest, where the shadows never truly leave. Once again a fire was built, and the children were told to wait while their parents went off to work. But this time no branch was tied to a tree to mimic the sound of an axe. The woods were dead silent. Arlo and Alma shared the girls' small crust and eventually fell into a sleep born of exhaustion. When they woke, the night was thick, and there wasn't a silver stone to be seen. "Don't worry, sissy," Arlo said, his voice a little less certain than before. "When the moon comes up, we'll see the crumbs I dropped." But when the moon rose and washed the forest in light, the ground was bare. The mountain has its own residents. The crows and turkeys had pecked the path clean, leaving nothing but damp earth and fallen leaves. Arlo and Alma were truly lost. They wandered for 3 days and 3 nights, their legs trembling like jelly. They ate nothing but a few bitter winter berries they found beneath the brush. On the third afternoon, they saw a little snow-white bird sitting on a low-hanging pine branch. It sang a tune so sweet, it seemed to pull the weariness right out of their bones. When it finished, it flapped its wings and flew ahead, looking back as if to see if they were following. The bird led them into a clearing where the trees fell back, and there sat a cabin the likes of which they'd never dreamed. The air was filled with the scent of boiling sorghum and wintergreen. The logs were chinked with white sugar. The roof was shingled in amber molasses candy, and the window panes were clear, jagged rock candy that caught the light like diamonds. Arlo reached up and snapped off a piece of the eaves, and Alma began to nibble a pink wintergreen lozenge from the porch rail. As the sugar hit their tongues, a strange, warm heaviness began to settle over them. The memory of their father's face blurred, and the forest cold didn't seem so biting anymore. It was a sweet, foggy comfort that made the world beyond the clearing feel like a dream they'd already forgotten. Then a voice as warm and sweet as a summer afternoon called out from inside. "Nibble, nibble, little mouse, who's that nibbling at my house?" The children froze, but the sugar had already begun to slow their senses. Arlo felt as though he were standing neck-deep in water, his limbs heavy and slow. "It's only the wind," he whispered, the words feeling thick in his mouth. He knew he should run, but the sugar mist in his head told him to stay. Before they could find their feet, the door creaked open. A woman stepped out, leaning on a locust-wood cane. To their tired, clouded eyes, she looked like the finest mountain granny you could hope to meet. Her hair tucked under a clean white bonnet, and a smile so bright it seemed to light up the whole clearing. "La, you poor little birds," she softly said, her voice sweet as honey. "You look like you've been etched out of shadow. Come in, and don't you fret none. No harm's gonna find you under my roof." She led them inside and set a table that made their heads spin. Fried pies, ham, hot biscuits with yellow butter, and mugs of cold milk. Afterward, she tucked them into beds with quilts so soft they felt like clouds. Arlo and Alma drifted off thinking they'd finally found a piece of heaven. But the children had been fooled. The old woman wasn't a kind granny at all. She was a conjurer, and she was running out of time. Her youth was leaking away like water from a cracked jar, and she needed a lump vessel to perform the ritual to bring it back. The shack had been dressed in sweets to lure in a child for just that purpose. As she watched them sleep, a jagged grin transformed her kind face. "I've got 'em now," she hissed. "The moon is turning, and when this boy's fine and fit again, he's got just the kind of spark I need." Before the sun could burn the frost off the hemlocks, the old woman's kindness was gone. She snatched Arlo out of his warm bed with a grip that felt like iron hands. Without a word, she dragged him out to the small corn crib behind the house and threw him behind the wooden slats, rattling a heavy padlock into place. She stomped back inside and shook Alma awake. The face that had looked like a kindly granny's the night before was now a map of deep gray wrinkles, and her hands trembled. "Get up, girl. Go fetch water and boil the oats. My bones are turning to ash and my skin is thinning like parchment. You'll do the chores while I'm too old to manage." She leaned close to Alma, her breath smelling of soured milk. "Your brother's going to give me back what the years took away. I'm going to draw the youth right out of him and take it for my own. You'll stay and do the hauling and the heavy work while I fatten him up fit for my spell." Each morning the conjurer would limp out to the crib, her face aging more each day. She was mostly blind now, so she'd call out, "Arlo, put your finger through the slats so I can feel if you're getting some meat on your bones." But Arlo was sharp. He'd kept a chicken bone from one of his dinners. When the blind woman reached out, he held out that brittle bone. She'd squeeze it and grumble, "Still as thin as a winter's twig. I'm pouring the best of my larder into you, and you're staying as scrawny as a ghost." So she doubled his rations of ham and corn cakes. But not Alma. The witch meant to keep Alma dazed on a diet of enchanted candies and stale pastries. Every night Alma would pitch them into the ash pit, then sit by Arlo as he passed the wholesome food through the slats of the corn crib, sharing his meal with his sister. Together they stayed sharp and waited. Each day as Alma worked, she learned more and more of the truth of their valley. Neighbors came to the Conjurer from far and wide, trading their money, their silver pocket watches, and gold lockets for sour spells and hexes. The witch was the source of that gloomy gray fog that seeped through their valley, and she bled the holler dry. Weeks passed, and the witch's patience finally snapped. Her skin had grown so thin it looked like wet tissue stretched over bone. "I'll wait no longer. The moon is cresting and my time is up," she shrieked. "Stout or thin, scrawny or fat, I'm taking his spark today before I fade to nothing." The witch hobbled toward the root cellar built into the side of the hill. "I need the black root from the bottom shelf," she wheezed. "Go fetch it, girl." Alma knew it was now or never. She looked into the dark, damp hole and shook her head. "Which jar holds the black root, Granny?" Alma said, her voice slow and thick. "I don't know the herbs." "You useless, thick-skulled brat," the witch hollered. She was so frantic to begin the ritual before her heart gave out that she lost her own cunning. She leaned into the root cellar, gesturing with her locust wood cane. "I'll find it myself." As the ancient woman disappeared into the shadows of the cellar, Alma grabbed the keys hanging from the witch's waist. With a strength born of 3 days of winter berries and 2 weeks of fear, she swung the heavy oak door around and slammed it shut, throwing the iron bolt home. A terrible, hollow shriek came from beneath the earth, and then silence. A fine puff of gray dust drifted out from under the door. Alma ran to the corn crib. Unlocking the chains, she released her brother from his prison. For a moment, they just held each other in the cold mountain air. "We have to go, Sissy," Arlo whispered, "before the house goes, too." As they looked back, the cabin began to change before their very eyes. The sugar chinking turned to gray mud, the wintergreen lozenges shriveled back into bitter hemlock needles, and the molasses shingles crumbled into rotten bark. The candy house was nothing more than a rotting shack. In the ruins, they found the only real things the witch possessed: gold coins, watches, and lockets that the neighbors had traded for their misery. Arlo and Alma filled their pockets with the valley's stolen wealth and struck out, away from the clearing. The birds that had eaten their breadcrumbs now seemed to lead the way, chirping a path back through the deep stands of timber. By the time the moon rose, they saw a familiar sight: the steep ridges that would lead them home. The gray fog in the valley had begun to lift, and the night sky was clearing. For the first time in a long time, the neighbors had unbarred their doors. Arlo and Alma stopped at every cabin with an open door, returning treasures to the folks who had traded them away. When they reached their own cabin, the door was standing wide open. Their father was sitting on the porch, his face aged with a different kind of sorrow, the kind that comes from deep regret. Their stepmother was gone. She had followed her own bitter heart into the deep timber and never returned. And when the woodcutter looked up and saw Arlo and Alma, he let out a cry that echoed down the holler. He no longer saw mouths to feed. He saw his greatest treasure returned to him. With the witch gone and the treasures returned, the people of the hollers started looking after one another again. And wouldn't you know it, even in the hardest winters that followed, Arlo and Alma never went hungry again.